Greetings and salutations, and welcome back to the Hardcore Paladin with a One Talent Challenge. I had an interesting discussion, and it's something I wanted to mention. As my brother and I were talking about the whole the Steam profit that Steam has made this past calendar year. And my brother was talking about specifically, um, that Gabe, it's privately owned. Perfectly fine. Privately owned, I have no issues with that. In fact, that's a benefit. Because anything that's privately owned means you don't have to answer to shareholders and they're not going to try to squeeze you out for a buck. Now, the fun part about this is when him and I were talking about it, I said if you think about it, like operational costs of things, operational overhead of power, the coolant, the parts, the PC parts, all the things you have to get to keep the servers up and running for every single server, essentially, that exists at Steam. And you have to do that for every game. So you have, obviously, every single game on Steam that runs on a server needs to have server space, needs to have server load that it can pull, and of course you need internet and everything. But there's operational costs. But there was a bunch of people on Twitter that were complaining and bemoaning that, you know, because Gabe Newell purchased another yacht, that Steam is making too much money and that they should reevaluate the share, the profit sharing. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know if anything has changed. When I uploaded a game to Steam, when I uploaded my game to Steam, there was no payment. There was no cost to upload it. But they took a cut of whatever you made on the game. No problem with that. You're hosting it. That's server operational costs. It's everything. It's download, upload costs. I mean, we're talking everything that exists. I can understand you having to take a percentage of it. Now, let's go one further. A lot of people were saying, that this is not a good thing, etc., so on and so forth. Whatever. You can just paint Gabe Newell as a villain, and a lot of people do. Oh, I had stuff in there. Oops. Um. Ooh. Faster hit recovery. Keep that in there. I gotta go back to town. Anyway, they were painting Gabe Newell as a villain. And I'm like, wait a minute. Steam doesn't have to keep hosting my game available for download and available to play. They don't have to, but they do. They still have it there. There's no necessity to it. And the fact that it still is there just goes to show that, hey, there is a cost that they are absorbing into that system. Now, there are people that put games up for free, or they did back when you could just put a game up for free. And now this is costing Steam money in the long run. And by costing Steam money, they take a hit on it. They take an L. So you can make the statement that Gabe Newell's fleecing people and making billions of dollars and buying mega yachts. But the way I see it is this: I'm not going to sit there and white knight for Steam. No. Instead, I'm going to go different. I'm going to go the different route, and I'm going to say Steam is offering you a service. They're offering everybody a service. They're offering also an ability to play your games for free. No server cost required, no subscription fee, no anything. If you want to find that level of service somewhere else, you're more than welcome to. Epic Games takes a higher share, I believe, when you host on their site. And people don't like it as much. You'll get more traction on Steam considering the majority of people use it. So your options are Steam or nothing, quite literally. Though other options do exist, it just... you're unlikely to get a good one. And this causes people to kind of have a fit about it. But after I had this long discussion with my brother's like, well, you also have to think. They sunk billions of dollars into research on the Steam Deck and other framework products, like the new Steam block console thing that they made. They've invested money into it. And he said, so there's money that they might not get back, because if the console thing doesn't sell very well, they're never going to see that money. So now you're talking they're taking a loss on that. So there's an argument to be made for how Steam is running things. Do I think they're inherently evil? No. Do I think Gabe Newell is inherently greedy? Also no. I think he's a man running a business, and I think he's doing a decent job of it. That's what I think. And I think the people that are having an issue with how he runs business are trying to, in almost a very simplistic sense, strong arm him for more money. Can he afford it? Sure, he can. But is it right to do that? No, it's not. I mean, imagine if all of a sudden Gabe Newell said, you know what we're doing? Because everybody wants more of their profits for their games being hosted on our servers and our services. We are now going to instead start charging people a monthly fee to access Steam. Imagine if they did that. Steam would die overnight. And then people would be like, oh, now I have no place to host my game. Well, what brought about that change? You people demanding a higher profit share. It's your intellectual property. You don't have to host it on Steam. They don't have to host it for you. There's nothing that says you must use Steam. You use Steam because you know it gets you the most traction. Then you complain about it. That's like somebody hosting you, and you are their guest, and they are your host. You don't get the ability to say, well, the hosts were absolutely abysmal for allowing me to do what I wanted with my product and not having any say over it whatsoever. It'd be like if I went to somebody else's house, right? And I said, they were terrible hosts. They didn't allow me to fold my laundry the way I like it. That's it. That's effectively what they're doing. That's effectively what they're complaining about with Steam. Again, you don't have to host on their site. Nobody has to use their service. They could just as easily migrate to their own independent little website. They could go buy a website domain name and push their game there. If they want to talk about costs. And then they can buy servers and host them. And then they want to talk about costs. You're getting something out of Steam for that profit sharing. And people, think their time is worth money. I mean, I'm not going to say it's not. But the people that sit there and say, my time's worth more because I've done this, and this, and they run down a checklist in their head. Okay. What about other people that have done it and their product is not as good? Are they worth that amount of money? Who's the arbiter? Who draws the line in the sand? I mean, it's no different than Unreal Engine. I know Unreal Engine kind of sucks, but it's no different than Unreal Engine because Unreal Engine says, you can use their service for free, and you have access to all of their services for free. That is, until you start selling a game and making money, at which point you then owe them money. per game sold. I just don't understand the mindset. I really don't. It's always boggled me. And it always comes from the same group of people, too. You know what I'm saying? It comes from the same set of people that are like, corporate greed is the problem here. And then they turn around and start talking about their own personal greed and how it's not corporate greed. That's because they're not a corporation yet. Once they become a corporation, it then it morphs into corporate greed. But until that point, it's personal greed, and that's different. But no, we had that discussion about it, and we kind of both came to the consensus that we think it's just perfectly fine. Given the profit and losses, you take a look at the profit and loss of Steam. Yeah, they're making a profit, but that's because they're doing everything right. They're not making blunders. They're not going around and making bonehead mistakes and ruining their positive image. Do they do things wrong? Yeah, they do some things wrong. I'm not going to say that they're flawless. They have flaws. Everything does. Me, you, companies, every single thing on this planet has a flaw to a degree. And in saying that, so nothing is flawless, but I'm just saying they do a bang-up job given what they've got. That's what I'm saying. But on to other things. I had a bit of an epiphany. And I can't even say it's an epiphany. I am one who questions a lot of things. And this is going to be an unpopular opinion, I'm sure, but then again, what haven't I said that's a popular opinion? I often say a lot of things are unpopular. I was rewatching the moon landing footage from the 1960s. And a thought occurred. And the thought that occurred was simply this. When you look at the moon landing, we are told by every single aeronautical space engineer and every single, everything, that the Apollo mission, when it landed on the moon, had enough fuel to take off and make it back. Okay. So it had enough to take off and make it back. So when you see the Apollo landing pod lift off, who was left on the surface to record it? Because you can watch where the Apollo pod leaves the moon's surface and starts on its ascent off the moon and coming back. Now, of course, you're going to have a whole bunch of people in the comments saying, well, it was just, videotape that they patched into whatever. Wireless technology did not exist in 63 or 69. Wireless technology did not exist. Doubly so for wireless video technology. That wasn't publicly available in a handheld size until the 80s. And even then, you needed the physical tape to come back with you. So, who did they leave behind? Because there's no way they could have gotten that footage without having to turn around and go pick up the tape. And they couldn't because according to literally everyone, they didn't have enough fuel to do such a maneuver. So now what? We're left with the Sophie's choice here, which is something is not being told. Either they didn't make it off there, they didn't make it off the moon, they left someone behind, or it was filmed in a different location. The same could be said for phone technology. How did they talk on the phone? Wireless phones hadn't been invented yet. Yet they were patched through talking via radio, via phone call with the president on his desk. What'd they do? Patch the RF frequency through and play it through a phone without it going into complete feedback? Because when you play a radio receiver, or when you play a radio transmitter or an audio transmitter next to an audio receiver, you get feedback, and lots of it. You know that high-pitched whistle, and it goes into like a screeching and a warbling sound when you get a speaker too close to a transmitter, especially on older technology. That's a feedback. You get the feedback. Now, that's a very common thing that happens in older electronics. So there's no way they could have done that unless they had it patched in from the radio, and that phone was nothing more than a radio receiver. And it wasn't actually a phone. It was just a radio receiver, and he picked it up, and they had it patched in to look like a phone. That's the only way that could have been possible and achieved. The only other option is they faked it. Now, what would they have to gain by faking it? Dunno. A huge slush fund budget, basically called NASA, to do with it whatever they wanted. Think about it. Think about how much money's been funneled into NASA, even in the years when it didn't do much of anything. Where'd that money go? What'd they use it for? Now let's go a little bit further down this rather, how do I want to put this? Interesting rabbit hole of ideas. Mind you, this is purely conjecture, purely opinion. Take it for what you will. Let's say they took that money, and NASA, which was spawned off of old Popperation. Listen to me. NASA, which used to be old Operation Paperclip, used to be everybody that came from Operation Paperclip. Look it up. If you don't know who if you don't know the people of having a bit of a speech problem here. If you don't know the players, that was the word I was looking for. If you don't know the players in Operation Paperclip, you might have met them before. Heisenberg, Oppenheimer, Einstein, they were all German scientists. Specifically, German scientists circa 1939 to 1943. Majority of them came over through Operation Paperclip and settled here. Started working for NASA. Former Nazi scientists, actually. That's how the space program was formed. Now, knowing this, and now armed with this knowledge, what did they deal with? Well, Heisenberg had his uncertainty principle, but Heisenberg also had the thermal expansion. So thermal expansion can also be used when subjecting something with a steam layer. It can create a kind of like a plasma shield. If a liquid like water, specifically water, because water is a low boiling point, if a liquid is subjected to something that brings it to boiling point and beyond vaporization point almost immediately, it will create a steam shield, which is to a degree a plasma. Not that it is, but it's kind of like a plasma shield, preventing the item inside from being burned. That's the thermal expansion, because as things evaporate, their molecules move further and further apart. Thermal expansion. That's just the rough overview of it. Now, everybody knows the equation E equals mc squared. M is for mass. C squared is the speed of constant squared. What's the speed of constant? The speed of constant is the speed of light. So energy is equal to the mass times speed of light squared. That's a mathematical equation. Let's look at it as a mathematical equation. If you have energy reaching a point where it's equivocal to mass moving at the speed of light squared, what are you doing? Why are you sending mass to the speed of light squared? That's the $1,000 question. Because what do you gain from having mass move that fast? Realistically. Like, mass moving that fast does one of two things. Teleports or goes back in time. Because once you get closer and closer to the speed of light, you start suffering what's called time dilation. And time dilation starts making spherical objects look flat, etc., and amongst other things. This is all hypothetical. But they talked about time dilation. Now, why would you need energy to move something to the speed of light squared? Time travel is about the only thing. This was known to have been a thing that they've talked about when they were researching the Nazi bell, which tried to do the same thing but with audio frequencies. They tried to go back in time using auditory frequencies. Nothing too extreme. I mean, I can understand the premise behind it. Would it have worked? I don't know. However, now you have NASA, run by a whole bunch of former Nazi scientists who undoubtedly worked on the Nazi bell, who have potential theories dealing with time travel. And now you're giving them a slush fund budget. They make a moon landing. Now, a lot of them did not live, way longer than they were supposed to, but let's think about this. So now you have this group of scientists. What happened shortly after the 60s? In the 70s, they started doing this whole we need to save the coral reefs and other things. It was this first part of the whole environmentalist movement. The 80s is when it really took off, but let's talk about right after the 70s, like in the 70s and 80s. This movement precipitated in making an interesting thing occur. How do you find the mass? This is just a question. How do you find the mass of a living object, of a human, or a dog, or whatever? A craft, even. How do you find the mass of a craft? Basically, high school physics 101. Mass and volume are interchangeable. And because mass and volume are interchangeable, how do you find the volume of an object. Archimedes' principle of water displacement. You submerge the item in water and make it displace water. And when it displaces water, you now know how much mass it weighs, because mass and volume are a 1-to-1 ratio. Armed with this knowledge, you now submerge a craft. Well, you can't submerge a craft with a working engine because it won't run. So what you do is you take a craft, you drain it of all of its fluids, because you already know what the fluid mass is, because you can already check the fluid volume of fuel. Its mass doesn't change. Its buoyancy does. Oh, it's less buoyant than water, so it floats. That's its density. Okay, cool. Its mass didn't change. Its volume didn't change. So anyway, you drain it of all its fluids, and you sink the craft as it is. And you turn it into an artificial reef. Now, how do you figure out all of its volume? Simple. You find out exactly... You drive in these steel pilings. Okay? And you find out exactly how much water you have in there, because you could pump it out, fill it in. Doesn't really matter. You find out exactly how much water is in those steel pilings, those 4 steel squares, right? You put your craft in the middle of it, and you sink the craft. You then take the water level afterward. Now you have the volume of your vessel that you're transporting. And you've made an artificial reef to save the coral. Armed with this knowledge now, you have to now sink Bob, or Fred, or whatever his name is. You now have to make sure that he sinks to the bottom of the pool. But you can't just hold him down there with a metal pole. He won't survive. So now this raises a new problem. Now what do you do? Well, simple. You put Bill or Bob or Fred or whatever his name is in a spacesuit. A waterproof suit with an oxygen tank. You can make it look like a spacesuit, for example. And you now submerge him in the water. You now have the volume of him and all his equipment. Then you submerge just the equipment. Now you have the volume of just the equipment. Take the total volume minus the volume of the equipment, and now you have the equipment. Now you have the volume of Bob. Now knowing this and the volume of the vessel, you can now do your simple little math. When you do your simple math of your volume times your speed of constant squared, so you have to do parentheses exponential, so you take your speed of light squared, you take your speed of light, you multiply it by the speed of light, and then you multiply it by the mass. That is now equivalent to your energy required to make you travel that speed. To make you achieve that speed. Whether it be through particle acceleration or not, doesn't matter. Then look up the Philadelphia experiment. The Philadelphia experiment was a failed experiment to create a cloaking device for destroyers. They made a movie out of it, and they said it was based on a true story in the movie. And there was also a book written about it. Some people say it's science fiction. Other people believe it to be a true account. If it is, it is. If it's not, it's not. I leave it up in the air. However, it was basically a black book project. They weren't allowed to talk about it. and they had a skeleton crew on the destroyer, and they basically were in the harbor. And they tried to make it, quote, disappear. I think they tried to send it back in time. And I think they failed. Because they claimed when the boat reappeared, people were fused to the deck planks. And people were fused to the sides of the hull. Because everything came back all discombobulated. Which is what happens when you have your volume and your energy wrong. Those parts of it don't come back. Is this in Lower Cross? No, it just says Cross Bazaar. Okay. So, it was shortly after the Philadelphia experiment, the failed one, that they looked into submerging their vessels. And that's roughly the time that I believe NASA came into existence. I think that's what the black budget of NASA was used for. I can't even say the black budget. I think that's what NASA's budget was used for. Was funneling it into a program to try to master either teleportation or time travel. Because it's the only thing that really makes sense. Because one would not go and just take a look at all of the knowledge that these Operation Paperclip people had and said, you know what? Nah, it's not worth anything. Especially when you figure out that interstellar travel had already been mastered by the Germans. Truthfully, just look up the V2, I believe it was the V2, the Buzz Bomb. It's intermittent rocket propulsion. Intermittent rocket propulsion is the key to interstellar travel let me rephrase it, is the key to fuel conscious interstellar travel. Because if you're traveling in a vacuum, you have no friction. If you have no friction, you have no drag. And if you have no drag, you don't lose speed. Your velocity goes ad infinitum. Same can be said, you can reach the speed of light squared by doing that. Because you will eventually reach that speed. Because you are... Whereas thrust works one way. I don't have the things I need. That's a shame. Oh. I have old stuff in the shared thing. I'm not going to use it. I need to make a new character. Because I haven't played... this is off ladder now. It was ladder when I made him, but then... Through streaming, I don't do it every day. Not streaming, sorry. Through recording, I don't do it every day, so it falls behind. But if you're in a vacuum and you're at your maximum speed and you hit a boost on your booster, it will increase your speed ever so slightly. And then at your new max speed, you do it again and again and again and again. You will eventually reach the speed of light. In order to counteract that, you would need propulsion going the other way, retro rockets as they're called. And that would become a counteracting force, allowing you to slow down in interstellar travel. The interesting part about this whole thing is the Germans figured this out in the 1930s, 1940s. They made the V2 Buzz Bomb to travel longer distances on less fuel, doing intermittent propulsion. And that was with drag, wind resistance, etc. And they still did it. What taught them that? Realistically speaking, that's advanced knowledge beyond human conception. Especially in the 30s. And if you think about it, just 20 years ago. Like, really look at that from a perspective, okay? In the 30s, the Germans came up with intermittent propulsion of rocketry. Just 20 years prior, they were hanging over the side of a biplane, dropping bombs by hand, using their eyes to target the ground. That's 20 years. Look at how far we've come in 20 years. Why the technological plateau? Really makes you think. If you think about it in this regard, you'll never see it again in any other way. I think human technology has hit a pinnacle, and I think it's only hit that pinnacle because the technological gap no longer exists between us and what we can reverse engineer. And I believe we've been reverse engineering off of alien technology for a while. Because once you hit a point, the human technology just doesn't go any further. Despite how ingenious people are, and we are. People like to downplay it and say, well, we're not, but we are. And the reason is because we've got that go-getter attitude, right? This was best described in a satirical Star Trek thing where they were talking about how the members of the Star Trek Enterprise are run by humans and not by Vulcans and not by Klingons and not by things like the Borg. And they were talking about there's this great post, and the Vulcan was talking to a Klingon in the bar, and he said, look, he's like, the reason why we have humans as the head of the Starship Enterprise, he's like, because these people, they said, you know that warp drive you guys needed that the humans stole? And they're like, yeah. He's like, well, you know what they did with it? They took that warp drive and they decided what would happen if we slapped this warp drive together with another warp drive. Maybe it would go twice as fast. And they said what it ended up doing is it ended up going so fast it tore a toroidal hole in the fabric of space-time and sent us to an alternative dimension where we stole another warp drive to get back. And if you think about it, this is easily depicted in almost every single thing on Star Trek where they said the Klingons were the first to fall against the Borg because they used tactics and logic. The Vulcans fell to the Borg because they used tactic and logic. Meanwhile, the Starship Enterprise lured the Borg into the holodeck and ended up killing them with solidified light beams in a make-believe fantasy world. Yeah, and mind you, I didn't watch the show. This is just what I've read. But it makes a whole lot of sense. Humans are just illogical, impulsive creatures. We are creatures driven by logic. Men are creatures driven by logic. Women are creatures driven by emotion. But we do impulsive things that are illogical. Why? Because we have that spark of, what if? It's that curiosity. Nothing can satiate the human curiosity until we do it. And when you do it, and this human curiosity is satiated, and you sit there and you're like, what if? And that's the problem, is because as soon as you get done, you start thinking again. But we're almost to the end of Act 3 on the Paladin. And I wanted to make this about 45 minutes, and it's at 40 minutes right now. I'm just submitting this opinion. In my opinion, I think that the moon landing was faked. Because I just came to the conclusion of asking that question, of saying who was left behind when they filmed the liftoff of the lunar lander. That question alone made me call everything into question. And then you take a look at all the stuff it's linked to. NASA's linked to Operation Paperclip, which is old Nazi scientists that dabbled in rockets, time travel, teleportation theory, uncertainty principles, quantum physics. They all dealt with stuff like this. All of it. Take a look at Nikola Tesla. He wasn't a Nazi scientist, but he was a European electrophysicist. He dealt with electrics, and he dealt with electronics, and I think at some point in time, the world got its hands on foreign technology, space technology, from other star systems, and have been reverse engineering it. Because in the span of my life, we went from computers that took up an entire room and required punch cards to this. And this can run what massive data centers back then could not. And there's nary a peep as to how. There's no logical pathway if you really think about it. Unless if you take reverse engineering space technology off the table completely, right? And you look back, who would have thought, let's take a silicone chip, let's take sand, melt it down, make a silicone based product, and then etch circuitry on it, and then print it and have it come out. And then we're going to have it do mathematical computations. I'm sure that wasn't high on everybody's mind. But the moment people saw whatever crashed in Roswell, amongst other things, the moment people saw this stuff and were like, wait a minute, how are they able to do this? How are they able to make 90-degree turns, 120-degree turns, 180-degree turns, and not splatter themselves all over the place? Enter thrust vectoring. Why is it the only nation that has jets with phenomenal thrust vectoring? Why is it the only nations that have this are the nations that had the most unidentified flying object encounters? Interesting. I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying it might be. Because thrust vectoring is not exactly easy. But I digress. This is where my mind wanders when I do stuff. I hope everybody enjoyed this video. And if you disagree with my opinions, that's perfectly fine. You're more than welcome to. I know I enjoyed this video. Because I kind of like going off on these little philosophical jaunts, theory jaunts, so on and so forth. And submitting new opinions and submitting new ideas and kind of having this thought, just kind of like mental escape. And the reason I say that is there's not a lot of people that do it these days. In fact, there's very few. And even less do it unedited on YouTube. And the reason being is maybe because it's partially educational. Maybe it's because it opens up the critical thinking pathways. And maybe that's the design, is to shut that down. Because critical thinking does one thing that nothing else will. And that's bringing back what we lost ages ago, was the ability to say, what if? People have gotten to the point of complacency by saying, well, it's a settled science. Really? The whole basis of science is to look at something and go, what if? That's the whole premise of science. Is to question it. Is to question everything. And so we should. And when we do, it brings us closer to the truth. Whatever it may be. That's going to do it for me. I hope everybody has a fantastic evening, a wonderful tomorrow, and as always, have a good one.